Hi folks, you're with Tacit, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the misinformation, disinformation, lies, grotesque untruths, ridiculous assertions, and pure fabrications that go around the discussion or the assertions about slavery, particularly slavery to the Americas and to the Caribbean, or in the Caribbean. I noticed a number of books. I picked up a book from the 1950s, history book about the Caribbean, and it was talking about, well, the plantations really of that area, in the islands of Nevis and so on, where Alexander Hamilton of American independence fame got a mention. But this was a fairly bland, and slavery was mentioned in very factual sort of terms. It wasn't couched in a moral sort of framework. It was simply stated as a fact of the times, and the issues were more about, again, hard facts and the realities of the era when slaves were being brought from or primarily West Africa to the Caribbean, and of course to the Americas as well. Now, there was hardly anything exceptional in those sort of mentions, and again, there was no sort of moral couching or framing of the issue. It was purely how things were, and there's no mention whether it's good or bad or this or that, and so one's able to make a judgment based on historical facts. Now that no longer exists. The historical facts have faded into almost utter irrelevance. The historical context of slavery and the fact that slavery was around for thousands upon thousands of years, where over a million white people were enslaved by the Arabs, and where millions upon millions, tens of millions of blacks were enslaved by each other. So today we only look at it, or we're being forced by the globalists anyway, to look at it purely in the basis of racial conflict terms. And they want this racial conflict, the globalists. So little surprise that this is what they're pushing this so hard. I think you'd struggle to find more than a handful of slaves anywhere in the world that white people directly enslaved. I just don't think they exist. Blacks enslaving each other and selling them to white people, well, that clearly went on. Arab slavers capturing or buying black slaves from other blacks, and selling them to the white plantation owners, that clearly went on. But I think you'd really struggle to find any black slaves that were enslaved by white people. But anyway, let's just get away from that for a moment. I'm looking at this is a modern sort of history of really the Caribbean, or some of the major characters in the Caribbean area in the 1700s and through to probably the early 1800s, I guess, or until the time when the British were starting to clamp down on slavery generally. So, and it primarily concentrated on sugar plantations, and there was a lot of work around a lot of activity, rather commercial activity around sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Now, here's sort of the rub here. In the desperate, modern historians are so desperate to couch slavery in a moral framework and to come out with ever greater assertions as to its wickedness and its evils and so on, that they because they're falling over themselves so much to go down this path rather than just stick to the facts, which you think would help. But the facts don't gin it up enough. That they want to have maximum ginning up of outrage. The evil white people, those fucking fascist fucking Nazis. They want to gin it up sort of like that. So they have to have an evil oppressor and helplessly oppressed and so on. And they can't stick to the facts, because the facts tell a different story. For example, if you're going to talk about history and say, well, the blacks enslaved each other and then sold sold their own countrymen. They enslaved their own people. They enslaved their own people and then sold them off as slaves to another. I mean, wow, look at evil black people enslaving each other. Those evil. No, they don't do that. The only bad people are the white folks. So anyway, the blacks enslaved each other, sold them to the slavers who were operating around the coast there, and then the ships arrived from Europe to pick up the slaves and take them to the Americas, which included, of course, the Caribbean. Now, in their desperate effort to make out that the slave trade was uniquely white and uniquely evil because whites were involved, and because they want to push that narrative, and it's probably demanded of them. If you want to publish a book, you have to portray the situation as being super evil white, super oppressed. They have to do it that way in order to get a publishing gig. But the claim is, I'm reading one book here, the claim is that 60% for fuck's sake, of the slaves died due to the most horrible and disgusting maltreatment by these evil white ship owners and slave transport ships. They were crammed. The black people were crammed together so tightly in the hole that they couldn't breathe. They were given no food. They were given no exercise. So then they came a 6 to 8 week, sometimes a bit longer depending on weather, 6 to 8 week voyage. They'd arrived without exercise and without food, in deplorable conditions at the other end, where slave like plantation owners were going to pay top dollar for these emaciated skeletons who would have been, and 60% of them died on the way, is the claim. Now that's so fantastic as to be beyond absurd. So I just want to talk a little bit about the sugar plantation work. Sugar plantation work was, it was hard work, and depending on how many people you had working the fields, it was, the weather was hot and steamy, and you had to work in the hot weather. So it was certainly a work that was arduous, and again in the hot sun all day. So it wouldn't have been easy. But so in order to gin up the thing there, these slaves worked naked with no shade. They worked from sun to sundown, beaten mercilessly, whipped till they couldn't move. The blood just was everywhere. Limbs fell off. So how are you actually going to get work done on your plantation if 60% of the slaves are dying before they even get there? The ones that do make it are in such poor shape they couldn't even lift a finger to do anything. Then as soon as you put them in the field, you beat them all to death. I mean, wow, that's so clearly that's absurd. But they're pushing so hard. They're pushing this ridiculous narrative. Maybe they found one ship where there was a lot of disease on it and 60%, and then they used that as the benchmark. I don't know, but I can't find any documentation or any facts to support any of these claims. The reality was this, that the ships picking up the slaves were paying big money for it, or whether that be through barter or whatever it was, or gold or exchange of finished goods or whatever it was, but they were paying the equivalent of serious money. The only way they were going to make money, the only way, and they're a commercial enterprise, the ship's been hired, it's been crewed, it's been victualled. The only way they're going to make money is to deliver fit, healthy, ready to work workers at the other end. That's the only way they can make money at this. So now the buyers at the other end are discerning, they're very discerning. So the rigor that some of these slaves were put through before somebody would purchase them was quite extensive. They would demand that the slaves would run and jump, both feet off the ground, could run, could bend over and pick up a heavy weight. They really put them through their paces. So clearly there'd been situations where they'd acquired slave workers before, but they'd been ill or unable to do the work. So the issue was they're going to pay top dollar for the slave, but the slave worker has to be able to go straight from the effectively straight from the ship onto in this case a sugar plantation and do the heavy work straight away. I mean, maybe a day or two, being shown what to do, but they had to start work straight away. That was the thing. So now there were various things that the ship owners tried to do. They would, for example, bring the slave workers on shore and keep them in a corralled area, feed them good quality food, and then rub palm oil and things like that into them, get them all washed up and rub palm oil into them so they would look, leaner and more lithe than perhaps they were in reality. But the plantation owners would often, in fact, nearly always, particularly the bigger plantations, they would hire specialist, inspectors who could go on and they could spot somebody who wasn't, a slave worker that wasn't fit enough to do the work. So no, I'm not paying that. And in some cases, where the slave worker was in poor health or maybe just simply not capable of doing the heavy work, then nobody would buy them. And so they'd be, they'd end up going through a ridiculous thing of trying to pay people to take them as a house servant or something like that. So the only way these slavers, these transport ships rather, would make money is to have as many fit, healthy, ready-to-work slaves as possible at the other end. So this idea of 60% casualty rates, and they'd all arrive emaciated and sick and unable to even move because they were so ill. That's all utter and total bullshit. That they had to arrive fit at the other end. And given the rigorous tests they were put through, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the running, the jumping, the lifting of the weights, and so on. These plantation owners were discerning buyers. That you had to be able to work straight away. Now, the next layer was the next thing that these modern histories, the ones that the globalists are forcing on us, the lies and the grotesque untruths, is that the slaves were being beaten. Every slave was being beaten mercilessly every day. So they were put out to work in the hot sun. They weren't allowed any water. They weren't allowed anything to drink. They weren't allowed anything to eat. Well, evil fascist Nazi slave owners whipped them and beat them and tore them to pieces every day until there was not a single worker. No. You had to be able to do the work. You had to be able to harvest the sugar cane and do the heavy work. Also in transporting it to the the distilleries and things like that. So you needed a lot of your workers all had to be on the ground and working. So you had to provide water for them. You had to you couldn't beat them to the point where they couldn't work. Now, would you shout and scream at them? Maybe, but they all had to work. They had to be fit. Now you had to feed them a diet that kept them fit enough again to do that heavy work. If you wanted them out in the fields every day doing heavy work, you had to give them hats to keep the sun off them. You had to give them some sort of shade or clothing to keep the to keep them from getting sort of sunburned to the point where they couldn't work. So the idea was to have as many fit people on the ground working at any one time, and you don't get that by starving them or having them die of thirst or beating them and whipping them all day. Now some examples were picked up with slaves that kept on running away or refused to work, or one slave that I read about where the guy was just a perennial goofball. He was constantly deciding he'd fall asleep, and he'd find a tree in a nice shady spot and lie down and fall asleep. And he'd been warned several times and this sort of thing. And in the end, they ended up meting out ever increasing levels of harsh punishment, which seemed to have no effect on this guy. He'd end up getting whipped or something. You go, don't care, and he'd still go off again. So there were, you can find those sort of situations, but again, they're very rare because you got to have all the workers on the ground. Now, there's also other factors like the distilling the sugar cane and so on. Especially where it's to create other products like spirits, for example. Then they perish under the heat, and you've got to once you produce a certain amount of these products, you have to ship them, and they had to be ready, when the ship comes in, and all sorts of things like that. So again, you can't afford the luxury of thinking, well, what I'll do is I'll just whip and kill half my workers, and so then I won't get anything. So when the ship comes in, I got nothing. You don't do that. No commercially minded person would do that. And some of these people, by the way, are borrowing very considerable sums of money to run their plantations until they're able to ship their produce offshore, whether it be to go to Europe or indeed to North America, like around New York and Boston and so on. So so when I look at this, look at these claims in these history books that 60% mortality, they're all beaten, slaves are all beaten to death, and this, and you look at them and say, hold on a minute, the plantations that are supposed to be beating all their slaves to death and all this sort of thing, they somehow are the biggest shippers of sugarcane. So how can you be the biggest sugarcane plantation if you're killing all your workers? So you look at the contradictions in there, and you see that some of these things are just blatant untruths. And my guess is that they managed to find one instance of a slave being beaten to death, or one instance of a ship with unusually high mortality rates and so on, and then they're saying, well, that happened everywhere. I'm guessing that's the thing. So at least they can fall back onto there's the example. So so as I trawl through these, there's a couple of different sources of history books. Another one was that the claim that about the millions of slaves that were brought to the Caribbean because so many of them died. This is the allegation that the globalist controlled propagandist historians using, because so many of the slaves died, that there must have been tens of millions that were shipped to the Caribbean. So now let's have a look at that. If we look at the hard numbers of the main port of entry for the slave ships coming from West Africa, and their figures that they record, the difference between the slaves collected from West Africa and the slaves arriving in these ports is give or take about 15%. Now, so if 100 slave workers were embarked in West Africa, 85 would arrive at the other end. Now you say, well, that's terrible. It's diabolical. That's proof of Nazis. But the white crews of the ships, so the white crews of the ships had about the same mortality rate. So that's nothing to do with race or Nazis or fascists or anything. That's when you're on those ships out at sea during those times with that the medical technology of the day, then those were standard sort of standard numbers for mortality or people becoming ill, not recovering and dying, that sort of thing. So that's hardly anything special there. That just seems to be a universal thing for long ocean-going vessels. Bear in mind that a journey that would take a few days on a ship today, back then was taking 6 weeks plus. So if we look at the amount of slaves that were arriving in these ports and then multiply that across the amount of years, and there's nowhere near the sort of amount of slaves they're claiming. They're claiming sort of 10 million minimum, when in reality it's closer to, say, over the maybe 900,000 or something like that. The other thing too is that given that slaves were so expensive to buy, the local slavers, the local plantation owners not simply the Caribbean, but the Americas generally, they encouraged procreation. And it was considered to be more economical to get the slaves who already had to procreate, and then wait the amount of years it would take before the newly born infants were old enough to do some work. It was cheaper to do it that way than it was to buy. Now, given the average price that these people were paying, that would strongly suggest that the slaves were arriving were actually in very good condition. Maybe not every single one of them, but you could only get top dollar for slaves that were in very fit condition and could do all the running and the jumping and all the things that the plantation owners wanted to see. So this idea they're all arriving sick and emaciated, that's simply not true. Would there have been some, I guess, but so once we sort of pull away the propaganda here and the lies and the untruths, and there's a shitload of those, and we start to see a different story. Now, one of the ways you can navigate through this as an amateur historian is you can start comparing. So, well, hold on a minute, this plantation owner is supposed to be killing all his slaves and beating them to death, happens to be the biggest producer of sugarcane. You can't be the biggest producer of sugarcane if all your workers are dead, or emaciated, or starved to death, or whatever. So clearly that's not the case. You can't, again, in order to be the biggest producer, you have to have the biggest workforce, and that workforce has to be capable of doing the hard, heavy work. So they have to be fit, and there has to be many of them. The idea that the plantation owners were always desperate for new slaves because of the huge mortality rate, that doesn't pick up either, because there's quite a high resistance to paying the sort of money that the slave traders want. If there was such a shortage, then they would pay the big bucks. But they were reluctant to do so, preferring to rely on procreation. So once you start comparing, well, if there was such a high mortality rate, then this would be the outcome. Or if there was such an inability to get enough slaves, then they would have responded in this or that way. But if you follow the behavioural pattern through the cycle, as it goes from one sort of stage to the other, you say, well, hold on a minute, that doesn't work, because if that was the case, they would have paid a lot. Well, that doesn't work either, because if all the slaves were there, 60%, and the rest were emaciated, then nobody would have paid for these, and so on. So you need to compare these things, because once you start doing that, you realise just how many lies you're being told about this whole slavery thing, and how isolated instances are seized upon in order to try and illustrate a reality that never ever existed. And of course, while the black slaves were being transported to the Americas, including the Caribbean, then at the same time, Barbary pirates were combing not only the Mediterranean Sea, but also the English Channel, and landing in places like Cornwall and the southern coast of England, and were landing there, and with virtual impunity, just grabbing, particularly women with red hair and freckles seem to be the real thing, grabbing women to take off to the harems of that North Africa, those North African areas around there. So the Barbary pirates were grabbing white people all over the place and enslaving them. And if the slavery against black people is so bad, then so much slavery against all people, anywhere, at any time. And that failure to broaden the lens to include all slavery is what makes the black slavery, or as was done by whites in that time, to try and hold that up as the only example of evil and wickedness throughout the entire history of the human existence. That in itself is a grotesque untruth. You've been with Tacitus to rate your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.